The church bells rang 3 times and fell silent, leaving behind a heavy emptiness that pressed against every breath. Everyone thought Dr. Peter Rowan's memorial service would end quietly until a woman's voice tore through the air. "You hit it well, but people deserve to know the truth. My daughter is Peter's child." All eyes turned toward the woman holding a 2-year-old in her arms. It was Elaine Carter, the widow's younger sister. Her hair dyed blonde lips painted a bright red that stood out sharply against the gray gloom of the funeral. The child in her arms startled and began to wail. Margaret Rowan sat in the front pew, her hands gripping the hymnal so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't react right away. She only turned slightly, her calm gaze frightening in its composure. Those who knew her understood that whenever Margaret was this silent, a storm was gathering inside. Elaine took a step forward, raising her voice so the whole church could hear. "Peter told me he would take care of Lily. This child is his blood. He even changed his will, leaving half of his estate to her." A murmur rippled through the rows of mourners. People looked at one another, then back at Margaret. Some of the older guests shook their heads in pity, while the younger ones gaped, sensing they were about to witness a family scandal in the middle of a memorial. Margaret rose to her feet. Light from the stained glass windows fell across her face. There was no anger there, no fear, only deep exhaustion etched into her eyes. She looked at her sister and spoke, her voice low but steady. "If Peter truly said that, I'll be the first to honor his wish. But today, you should let him rest." Elaine gave a cold laugh, the kind that belonged to someone who believed she had already won. "Still pretending to be noble as always, aren't you? But you know paper and ink don't lie." She pulled a stack of documents from her purse, waving them slightly in front of the crowd like proof of victory. "This is Peter Rowan's will. It has his signature, the date, and witnesses." Harold Denton, the family lawyer, froze for a few seconds before standing up. "I've never seen this document before." He accepted the papers, frowning as he skimmed them. The air thickened heavy and still broken only by the faint hiss of the sea wind slipping through the old church windows. Margaret didn't move closer. She just looked at Harold, her eyes asking the question, real or fake. He hesitated, unable to answer. Elaine kept talking, afraid someone might steal her moment of attention. "He loved me, even if it was brief. I wasn't going to say anything, but I can't let my child live in the shadows anymore." A woman in the back sighed softly. An old man nearby whispered, "Poor Mrs. Rowan humiliated right after her husband's death." The murmurs pricked Margaret's skin like needles. She closed her eyes, steadying herself, feeling the weight of pity, curiosity, and quiet contempt pressing in on her. When Harold finally set the document down, Elaine had stepped back, cradling her child with a triumphant smile. Margaret gave a faint nod and said evenly, "Thank you for coming. You can take Lily home now. This place is for those who came to honor him, not for a performance." The words shattered the tension in the room. Elaine flushed but forced herself to look composed. "You'll have to face the truth eventually. You've got nothing left to lose." Margaret didn't answer. She turned toward the memorial table, her steps slow and deliberate, each one pressing down on the weight of 30 years of marriage, the mornings when Peter made her coffee, his laughter, as he mended the fence, the scent of antiseptic, clinging to him after long hours in surgery. All of it undone by one accusation. The service ended in chaos. People left, whispering, glancing back over their shoulders. Margaret remained alone before her husband's portrait. She touched the cold glass and whispered, "If you were here, you'd laugh, wouldn't you? I know you better than anyone, Peter. But I need your help one last time. I need the truth." That night, the house by the bay was silent. Moonlight poured through the windows, silvering the wooden floor. Margaret sat in the living room the supposed will Harold had brought lying open in front of her. She read every line again and again. The phrasing was rigid, the wording awkward nothing, like Peter's professional tone. She had helped him draft medical reports before. She knew how he wrote. At the bottom of the page, the signature Peter Rowan trembled, the pen stroke sharp and broken. Peter had never written the letter R that way. He always connected it fluidly to the next word as if he refused to stop midway. Margaret gave a faint, bitter smile. Fake, she whispered. Amateur work. But the pain was real. To be humiliated in public, to be forced to doubt the man she had loved all her life, that was a wound words couldn't heal. When the clock struck midnight, Margaret opened the cabinet and took out the bottle of wine Peter had saved for a special occasion. She poured a glass and drank slowly. The taste was sharp and bitter heavy with memory. She thought back to their early years. Peter had been a young, gifted surgeon devoted to his work. They had married when she was in her 30s and tried for years to have a child. After a surgical complication, Peter had lost the ability to father children. He had once fallen to his knees, tears in his eyes, saying, "I'm sorry. You deserve to be a mother." Margaret had only held him close. "I have you. That's enough." And for 25 years, she had believed it. Now hearing someone claim he had a child with another woman tore her heart apart. Yet she didn't scream or weep. She simply sat there silent, the kind of silence born from a lifetime of endurance. The wind slammed against the windows, the curtains shifting restlessly. She looked out at the sea, the waves foaming white under the moonlight. The waters of Ashton Bay were always like that, wild, fierce, yet capable of keeping every secret buried deep beneath. Margaret set down her glass and wiped her tears dry. She opened Peter's desk drawer where he kept his most important things, medical records, receipts, letters, all neatly arranged. At the bottom lay a small velvet pouch holding a single key. On it was a faint inscription, "Private Locker, Ashton Savings Bank." A glint flickered in her eyes. Peter had never hidden anything from her unless it was to protect her. She sighed softly, leaning back in the chair. In the mirror, her reflection looked clearer than ever, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, no longer the fragile widow who had been shamed that morning. "I've endured enough, Peter," she murmured. "If they want to play games with lies, I'll show them what truth looks like." Outside, the sea roared, and within her waves began to rise not waves of sorrow, but of awakening. She had thought her life ended with Peter's death. Now she understood perhaps this was where it truly began. When the clock struck 1, Margaret gathered Peter's papers into a bag. She looked once more at his portrait, her gaze firm. "Tomorrow I'm going to the bank." Outside, the wind hissed through the old pine trees, sounding almost like a whisper. "Go, Margaret. The truth is waiting." That night, for the first time in months, she slept peacefully, not because the pain had vanished, but because she had found a purpose again to expose the one who humiliated her and to protect the honor of the man she loved. Deep in her heart, Margaret knew that if Peter were still alive, he would be smiling because the woman he trusted most was finally ready to fight. The next morning, a thin veil of mist hung over Ashton Bay, blurring the horizon like smoke. The sea was strangely still, but inside, Margaret, everything was boiling. She had been up since dawn, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, watching the pale light slowly spill into the room. On the table lay the small black velvet key, the only thing Peter had left behind that she'd never known about. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. If there's something you wanted me to find then today, I'll find it, she whispered, her voice steadier than ever. The bank was only 15 minutes away. Margaret walked in with a calm but resolute expression. The branch manager, Mr. Wallace, recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Rowan, my condolences again. How can I assist you today?" Margaret took out the key and placed it on the counter. "Peter Rowan. I believe he had a private safe deposit box here." Wallace nodded, confirmed the record in the system, and led her to the secure room in the back. The metallic clinking of the lock echoed as the mechanism released. A long silver box, clean and polished, as if untouched by time, slid out. Margaret sat down, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were several sealed envelopes, an old leather notebook, and a folded sheet of paper with a message written in Peter's hand. "Open only if I am no longer there to protect you." Margaret froze, her chest tightening as though something inside her had been squeezed. She sat motionless for a while, then carefully opened the envelope. Inside was the original will, notarized and signed with Harold Denton's name as the legal witness. The first line alone made her throat close up. "I, Peter Rowan, leave all assets, including the Bayfront House savings accounts, and all personal property to my lawful wife, Margaret Rowan. I have no biological children." Below that was the deep blue seal of the notary public, impossible to forge. Beneath it was a smaller envelope containing Peter's medical records. She read through them, and this time her hands truly began to shake. A surgical report from 10 years earlier confirmed that Peter had been permanently infertile following a pelvic operation. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Everything Elaine had said yesterday, the illegitimate child, the secret affair, was nothing but shameless lies. Margaret folded the documents, slipped them into her bag, and looked at the last remaining paper in the box. It was a handwritten letter in Peter's familiar slanted script. "If you're reading this, it means I can no longer protect you. I know you're strong, but I also know you trust too easily. I've worried that someday Elaine might do something reckless. I've seen how she looks at me, how she takes advantage of your kindness. I don't want you hurt again, especially not by family. If anything bad happens, go to Harold. He and I have secured all original records. And if this goes beyond what the law can handle, find Grace Porter. Remember her, the one who helped us when the old house was broken into. She knows how to deal with people who have no shame." By the time she reached the last line, Margaret could no longer hold back her tears. Peter had foreseen everything, even the possibility that her own sister might betray her. She pressed her lips together, wiped her face, and whispered, "Don't worry, I won't let them disgrace you ever again." That afternoon, Margaret drove to Harold's office. The elderly lawyer was waiting for her, his face serious. "I knew you'd come. This morning Elaine sent me another copy of that fake will asking to begin the asset division process. I refused, but she said she'd sue." Margaret placed the envelope on his desk. "This is the real one, and here are Peter's medical records. You know what to do, don't you?" Harold opened them, examined every page carefully, then looked up, his eyes brightening. "Perfect. Not a single flaw. We can completely nullify the fake will's validity." "But do you want to press charges?" Margaret was silent, staring out the window where seagulls circled above the silver water. "I'm not sure yet. I just want her to stop. But if I have to, I'll go all the way." "Grace is still in Maine, right?" Harold asked. Margaret nodded. "She lives near the Eastern Bay. I'll see her tonight." When Margaret arrived at Grace's house, the sky had already turned dark. The small wooden cottage glowed warmly, filled with the scent of roasted coffee. Grace, with short gray hair and a denim shirt, opened the door with a kind smile. "It's been too long, Meg. I heard about Peter." "I'm so sorry." Margaret squeezed her friend's hand. "Thank you. But I need your help with something big." They sat by the fireplace as Margaret recounted everything from the memorial service to the forged will and Peter's letter. Grace listened quietly, only nodding from time to time. I always thought Elaine was unreliable, but I didn't expect her to go this far. Meg, what do you plan to do? Margaret looked at her eyes firm. I won't let her silence me with lies, but I don't want to destroy what's left of our family either. I need proof, something even a court can't deny. Grace gave a faint smile. Then you're in luck. I still have a few contacts. I can dig into Elaine's finances, debts, transactions, and whoever helped her forge that signature. If she's committed a crime, I'll find it. Margaret placed a hand on her friend's shoulder. I knew only you could do this. That night, as she drove home, her heart felt heavy, but strangely alive with hope. Not hope that Peter would return, but hope that the truth would. She opened her front door and switched on the lights. The warm glow spread across everything. Familiar, their wedding photo. Peter's armchair where he used to read the paper, the lavender pot now beginning to dry. The house was as peaceful as ever, only she had changed. She went to the desk and pulled out an old photo of two little girls. Elaine at 10, hugging 18-year-old Margaret, both smiling brightly. The two children in that picture had once promised to always stay together no matter what. She looked at it for a long time, then murmured, I kept my promise. What about you, Elaine? The sound of waves crashed softly outside the window. Margaret closed her eyes. In her mind, she could see Peter standing by the doorway smiling at her. No distance, no loss, only the trust he'd left behind. She understood now that her strength didn't come from her pain, but from her ability to rise after being broken. Tomorrow, Elaine would learn that the sister she thought she could easily deceive had returned stronger, calmer, and ready to fight for the honor of the man she loved. Margaret stood up and turned off the lights, leaving only the small lamp on the desk. Its soft glow fell upon Peter's photo, making his eyes seem to shine brighter. Rest easy, Peter, she whispered. I won't let anyone stain your name again. Outside, the sea wind howled against the wooden walls, low and deep. The scent of salt drifted through every crack, like the breath of memory. And in that wind, Margaret heard a faint whisper as if from far away. I believe in you, Meg. Always you. She smiled softly. No more tears, no more trembling, only the calm certainty of someone who knows she's on the right path. Inside her, a quiet flame began to burn, the flame of truth, of justice, of love that refused to be defiled. Beyond the windows, Ashton Bay lay still, but for Margaret Rowan, the storm had only just begun. 3 days later, the sky over Ashton Bay was gray and heavy, the fog so thick it seemed the sea itself was keeping a secret. Margaret woke early, put on the gray wool coat Peter had once bought her, and stepped onto the porch. The salt in the air prickled against her skin, sharpening her senses. From somewhere beyond the mist, a ship's horn echoed lonely and distant. Today she would face her sister again, and she knew there would be no room for Grace. By noon, Elaine appeared at the gate without warning, her face carefully made-up lips painted a defiant red, her white faux fur coat glowing against the dim light. She looked like an actress stepping out of a tragic play she herself had written. When Margaret opened the door, Elaine forced a smile. We need to talk. Margaret stood still, one hand on the doorknob. I thought you said enough at the funeral. You misunderstood, Elaine replied quickly. I just want to clear things up. I don't want this to end up in court. She placed her purse down, her tone softening. You know I never wanted this. But Peter, he told me once that you didn't understand him, that he was lonely. Margaret looked straight into her sister's dark eyes. Can you look me in the eye and tell me you're not lying? Elaine blinked, took a small step back, then straightened again. Believe me or don't, but Lily is his daughter. And that will is fake, Margaret cut in her voice like a blade. Elaine froze, her smile fading. What did you say I said? It's fake, Elaine. So clumsy, I could tell at first glance. Margaret walked slowly to the table, pulling an envelope from her coat pocket. This is the real will notarized and witnessed. Peter left everything to me. He had no biological children. He's been infertile for 10 years, ever since a surgery you probably never cared enough to ask about. Elaine's face drained of color, her hand trembling as she clutched her purse. You're lying. I don't believe you. Believe it or not, Margaret said, setting the papers on the table. Her tone was calm, but carried a weight that froze the air around them. If you'd like, Harold can go over every word and every seal. Elaine turned away with a bitter laugh. You always think you're so clever, don't you? Like you own the moral high ground. Margaret looked at her sadness, more than anger in her eyes. I just want to know, how desperate are you for money that you'd invent such a filthy story? Elaine said nothing, her lips pressed tight. For a moment, Margaret saw the little sister she used to know, the stubborn, jealous girl who always needed attention. But that glimpse vanished, replaced by the hollow stare of a woman cornered by her own mistakes. You don't understand, Elaine whispered. I'm drowning in debt. My job's unstable. They're about to take my house. I didn't have a choice. Margaret shook her head. You always had a choice, you just chose wrong. She stepped closer, her voice low but firm. Peter once told me that if anyone could save you from yourself, it would be you. But it seems you don't want to be saved. Elaine turned away, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Easy for you to say. You had Peter money a home. What did I have? A child without a father, debts I can't pay. Do you even know what that feels like? Margaret drew a slow breath, steadying the emotion rising in her chest. Do you think I've never lost anything? That I don't know what loneliness is? Peter, and I couldn't have children, Elaine? Do you know how much that broke him? We've all suffered. The difference is, I didn't turn my pain into lies. The air thickened between them. Only the soft ticking of the wall clock broke the silence. Elaine wiped her tears and spoke bitterly. So what now? You'll throw me in jail. Tell the whole town I forged a will. Is that what you want to destroy me? Margaret studied her for a long moment. No, I want you to see who you've destroyed. She opened a drawer, pulled out Peter's letter, and placed it on the table. He knew you might do this, and even then he told me not to let you fall apart. Do you understand the man you smeared was still trying to protect you? Elaine stared at the letter, her tears falling freely now. She backed away, sinking into a chair, her face contorted in shame. I didn't know. Now you do, Margaret said softly. But knowing too late changes nothing. Harold and Grace already have the evidence. One phone call from me and you'll be charged with forgery. Elaine's head snapped up, panic flooding her eyes. You can't do that. I have Lily. Margaret looked out the window, her voice calm. That's the only reason we're talking here instead of at the police station. The child isn't to blame. She turned back, her gaze unyielding. I won't press charges, but you'll do 3 things. 1, you'll publicly admit you lied. 2, you'll sign the confession Harold prepares. And 3, you'll agree to let me create a trust fund for Lily that you can never touch. Elaine stared at her, dazed. You're punishing me. No, I'm saving you one last time. The room fell silent again. Outside, the rain began to fall, each drop hitting the porch with the steady rhythm of a heavy heart. Elaine bit her lip, then nodded weakly. Fine, I'll do it. Margaret looked at her sister for a long moment. Her eyes were tired, but somewhere in them was a fragile relief. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Harold's office. Grace will be there. After that, you're free. But remember, if you break this agreement, I won't hold back. Elaine said nothing. She picked up her purse and quietly walked out. When her figure disappeared into the rain, Margaret finally exhaled, only for tears to spill again. She didn't know if she had just won or lost another piece of her heart. That evening, Grace called. Meg, I went through the files. Elaine owes over $60,000. She's also being sued for credit card fraud. If this goes public, she's finished. Margaret's voice was steady. I don't want to destroy her. I just want Peter's name cleared. Grace paused. You're kind as always, but don't let kindness become another wound. After the call, Margaret sat by the window, watching the rain sweep across the bay. Through the mist, she could almost see Peter's gentle smile, the warmth in his eyes from their early years. It's almost over, Peter, she whispered. I'll make sure they know who you truly were. The next morning, Elaine arrived at the lawyer's office on time. Her face was pale stripped of its former arrogance. Harold read the agreement aloud, clause by clause. Elaine confessed to forging the will, agreed to issue a public apology, and allowed Margaret to establish the trust for Lily. When she finished signing, Elaine bowed her head and murmured, "Thank you. I know I went too far." Margaret didn't look at her. Keep your word. It's the only way to make this right. That afternoon, Margaret walked down to the beach. The wind was fierce, the waves crashing hard against the rocks, foaming white under the dark sky. She removed her scarf, letting the wind whip through her silver hair. She thought of 30 years of marriage, the dinners filled with Peter's laughter, the quiet evenings by the fire. Now there was only her, the sea, and a silence as deep as the tide. Yet within that silence she felt something new, freedom. No more shadows of suspicion or shame, no more proving her innocence. Peter's honor had been restored. As the sun set, she returned home. On the porch, Grace was waiting, holding a bottle of wine. "Thought you might need this," Grace said with a rough, kind smile. They sat together under the eaves, pouring wine, watching the sky fade into a deep violet. "Will you forgive her?" Grace asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. Maybe someday, but not today. Forgiveness takes time, and sometimes people have to pay to learn it. The wind carried the scent of salt across the porch. Grace raised her glass. Peter would be proud. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes fixed on the horizon where sea and sky blurred into a band of silver blue. He always said truth is like the tide. It can be hidden, but it always comes back. That night, as the lights dimmed in the bay house, the waves murmured softly in the distance, like a lullaby from the man she loved. Inside, the 56-year-old woman sat alone, her heart hollow but at peace. She knew the storm had passed, and tomorrow Ashton Bay would greet its first sunrise of a new beginning, where honor was restored and love still lived on, even if only in memory. The next morning, Ashton Bay was eerily calm. The sun rose slowly from the sea, its golden light spilling through every window like warm honey. In the kitchen, Margaret brewed a cup of ginger tea, the steam carrying a gentle, spicy scent. She opened Peter's old notebook where his handwriting remained neat and steady, as if his voice still lingered somewhere in the house. Live long enough, one line read, to prove to the world that kindness is never weakness. She smiled softly. For the first time in months, she had slept through the night. But that peace didn't last. Around 10 o'clock, Harold Denton called, his voice low and grave. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm afraid I have bad news. Elaine just withdrew her confession. She says she's taking the case to court." The cup in Margaret's hand tilted, spilling hot tea across the table. Her grip on the phone tightened, her breathing heavy. What did you say she claims she has new legal counsel, a young attorney from Portland? Apparently someone's promised to help her change her statement and turn the pressure back on you. She's demanding a DNA test. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Anger surged, then melted into exhaustion. Harold, are you absolutely certain Peter's procedure was irreversible? Completely, he said firmly. I've reviewed the original records myself with confirmation from the surgeon, but if this goes to court, we'll need supporting evidence. I can request a forensic review, but you should prepare yourself. Thank you, she murmured and ended the call. She rose slowly and walked out to the porch. The waves still broke softly along the bay, but each crash felt like a knife against her heart. Elaine had promised. She had cried, begged for forgiveness. And now, only a week later, she had betrayed her again. By noon, Grace stopped by carrying a paper bag of toasted bread and 2 cups of coffee. I heard Grace said, setting the bag down, "Are you all right?" Margaret shook her head, her voice tight. "I don't understand." I gave her a dignified way out. Why does she keep choosing destruction? Grace folded her arms. Because people like Elaine don't know what enough means. She lives in a constant state of lack. The more you give, the more she takes. You can't heal someone who doesn't want to change. Margaret held her coffee, staring out the window. I keep thinking about Lily. She's only 2 years old, too young to understand what her mother is doing. If this goes public, that child will carry the stain of it forever. So what will you do? Grace asked. Margaret's eyes hardened. I won't let her ruin anything else. If Elaine wants a fight, she'll get one. But this time I won't just defend, I'll strike back. Grace gave a faint, approving smile. Good. I still have a few friends in investigation. If there's someone behind her, we'll find out. That afternoon, Grace left with a list of contacts and Elaine's old records that Margaret had gathered. The house fell quiet again. Margaret sat at her desk and opened Peter's journal once more. Between his medical notes, she noticed a short passage written in pale blue ink. If one day the truth is twisted, trust the evidence, not emotion. She read that line over and over, then stood up. She knew what she had to do. The next morning, Margaret drove to the city hospital where Peter had once worked. Through old connections, she managed to meet Dr. McNeil, the surgeon who had performed Peter's procedure years ago. He looked older now, his hair silver, but his eyes were still sharp. Margaret, he said warmly, I still remember Peter. He was an exceptional doctor. I was sorry to hear of his passing. She explained the situation briefly. When she mentioned DNA testing, McNeil frowned deeply. Impossible. I performed that surgery myself. Peter couldn't father a child after that, not even with the best medical technology. I still have the original records in storage. If necessary, I'll testify. Margaret gripped his hand, her voice trembling. Thank you. You've just saved my husband's honor. When she left the hospital, a light rain had begun to fall. She pulled over by the bay, watching the boat sway gently on the water. The anger within her had cooled, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. If Elaine wanted everything dragged into the light, then she would show her what real light looked like. That evening, Harold called again. I just got official notice, he said. Elaine's filed a lawsuit accusing you of illegally withholding assets and concealing the legitimate will. Margaret let out a soft, weary laugh. Good. Then we'll end it in court. On the first day of the hearing, the Ashton County Courthouse was packed. Local reporters filled the benches, eager for a headline-worthy story about the disputed will of a respected doctor. Elaine arrived with her young lawyer dressed elegantly. Her face perfectly painted, her lips curved in a confident smile. She spotted Margaret and gave a small nod of greeting, but her eyes burned with defiance. Margaret entered quietly, carrying a single folder. She wore a simple black dress, her hair neatly pinned back. She didn't look at Elaine, only at the judge's bench, her expression calm and unwavering like the sea after a storm. When the proceedings began, Elaine's attorney spoke first, his tone loud and self-assured. "Your Honor, my client possesses the legitimate will of the late Dr. Peter Rowan, as well as evidence that the child Lily Rowan is his biological daughter. He painted Elaine as a struggling single mother, oppressed by her wealthy, heartless sister." Margaret's lips stayed pressed together. When it was their turn, she gave a slight nod to Harold. He stood composed and clear. "Your Honor, we have the original will notarized at Denton & Associates on February 14th, 2014 with verified witnesses. Furthermore, we have medical documentation proving that Dr. Peter Rowan was rendered permanently infertile 10 years before the child's birth." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Elaine's face went pale. She turned to her lawyer, her lips trembling. The judge struck the gavel for silence. "I will review all of these documents," he said. Harold presented them along with Peter's handwritten letter and Dr. McNeil's signed testimony. The evidence was airtight. Elaine's lawyer attempted a feeble objection, but even his client could no longer hold her composure. After nearly 2 hours, the judge adjourned the session. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret stood feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from her chest. Out in the hallway, Elaine rushed after her, catching her hand. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed help. I was scared of losing everything." Margaret looked down at her sister's trembling fingers, then slowly pulled away. "You already lost, Elaine. Not because of money, but because of trust." Her voice was soft but final. She walked away, leaving Elaine standing alone in the echoing corridor, small and broken. That evening, Margaret returned home, exhausted but clear-headed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she opened the windows wide, letting the sea air fill the house. The scent of salt and the rhythm of the waves wrapped around her like a familiar embrace. She could almost feel Peter's presence in every breath of wind. She poured a small glass of wine, raised it toward his photograph, and whispered, "I did it, Peter. They won't tarnish your name again. And you know what? I'm not afraid anymore. Because I finally understand what you meant when you said truth is strong enough to stand on its own, if only we never abandon it." Out at sea, the sun sank lower, leaving streaks of crimson across the water. Margaret closed her eyes. In the sound of the waves, she could almost hear someone laughing softly, warm, gentle, proud. 3 days after the hearing, Ashton Bay had returned to its usual calm, but inside Margaret the waves had not yet stilled. She knew the matter wasn't over. Though the court's preliminary ruling had favored her, Elaine still refused to sign the withdrawal papers. She was clinging to the idea of finding new evidence to overturn the decision. Margaret no longer felt anger or fear, only exhaustion. Exhausted from having to prove what should have been obvious, that an honest woman didn't need deceit to protect the honor of the man she loved. That afternoon, she went to the seaside market. The fish stalls and flower stands were as lively as ever. People recognized her, the silver-haired woman with the steady posture and calm gaze. They no longer looked at her with suspicion or gossip. Some came to speak to her, holding her hands tightly, their voices warm. "We always believed in you, Mrs. Rowan. This town owes you an apology." Margaret only smiled and nodded. She didn't need apologies, only peace. But peace still felt far away. When she returned home, she saw an envelope lying at her door. There was no name, only 2 hurried words scrawled across it for you. She opened it. Inside was a photocopy of the fake will, and scribbled along the margin in ballpoint pen were the words, "If you don't want this to go public again, meet me at the lighthouse at 8 tonight." Margaret studied the handwriting and recognized it instantly. It wasn't Elaine's. The letters were slanted and sharp familiar. It was the handwriting of David Connors Elaine's ex-boyfriend and the biological father of little Lily. She gripped the paper tightly as a gust of wind swept through the bay, carrying salt and sand into the room. At 8 that evening, Margaret arrived at the lighthouse, a small bar perched by the shore. The dim golden lights flickered as soft jazz drifted through the air. David was already seated in a corner wearing a worn leather jacket, his face pale and haggard from sleepless nights. "Thank you for coming," he rasped. "I didn't mean to threaten you, but you need to know what your sister's gotten into." Margaret sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "Talk." David glanced around before leaning closer, lowering his voice. "Elaine's involved with a loan shark named Miles Kerr. He's the one who helped her forge the will to get a loan. When the plan failed, he started threatening her, saying he'd spread rumors about Peter if she didn't pay. She thought you'd give in out of shame and share the inheritance. When you won in court, he turned to blackmail." Margaret said nothing. Her heartbeat quickened, but her tone remained calm. "Do you have proof David pulled a small USB drive from his pocket? I recorded one of their calls. Elaine was crying, begging him for more time. I didn't want to get involved, but I'm afraid of what he might do to Lily." She took the USB, feeling its weight like lead in her palm. "Why are you giving this to me?" David avoided her eyes. "I've got nothing left to lose. I was wrong to abandon Elaine. Now I just want my daughter safe. She's too far gone to protect herself." Margaret stood, placed some money on the table, and said, "Take this and don't contact Elaine again. I'll handle it." When she stepped outside, rain had begun to fall. The sea wind whipped droplets across her face, cold and stinging. But within her, a plan was beginning to form. That night in Peter's old study, she inserted the USB into the computer. A faint static filled the speakers, followed by Elaine's trembling voice. "Miles, I told you she'll give me a share. I just need a little more time." The man's voice was deep and harsh. "No more time, sweetheart. I've invested enough in you. If I don't get my money, I'll tell the press your whole family's a fraud. I've got a copy of the will, and I can make it look more real than the real one." Elaine sobbed. "Please don't. If my sister finds out—" He laughed coldly. "Your sister. She's just a rich fool. Don't forget who helped you get your evidence. Now pay up or I'll go see her myself." The recording ended. Margaret shut the computer. Everything was clear now. Elaine had lied, but she'd also been used, threatened, trapped, and desperate. Her anger dissolved into a deep, aching pity. The next morning, she went to see Grace. The former investigator listened intently, then nodded firmly. "I know Miles Kerr. He's been investigated for money laundering and loan sharking. If you've got that recording, we can force him out of hiding." "And," Elaine Margaret asked quietly. Grace met her eyes. "If you want to save your sister, this is your only chance. After this, you should let her go." That afternoon, they arranged to meet Elaine at a small cafe downtown. When Margaret walked in, Elaine was already there. Her eyes shadowed, hair unkempt. All traces of pride were gone. "I knew you wouldn't give up," she said hoarsely. "Miles told me not to meet you, but I'm scared, Meg. He's been watching me all week." Margaret leaned forward, her tone steady. "Has he called recently?" Elaine nodded, trembling. "Last night. He said, if I don't pay, he'll take Lily." Grace, sitting beside Margaret, switched on her phone's recorder. "You need to go to the police right now. I still have friends there, they'll believe me." Elaine broke down in tears. "I have no money, Grace. I borrowed from him to cover my debts, and he forced me to forge the will. I thought Meg would share. I swear I never meant to hurt her." Margaret listened, her chest tightening, but her face remained calm. "What matters now isn't what you meant. What matters is ending this." She took the USB from her bag and placed it on the table. "I have your call with him recorded. We'll take it to the police." Elaine looked up horrified. You have that recording. David gave it to me," Margaret said quietly. "He's afraid for his daughter." Elaine buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I've ruined everything, Meg. I don't deserve to be your sister." Margaret sighed, her eyes glistening. "You just need to learn how to live honestly. It's late, but not too late." That night, with Grace's help, the police set up a sting operation. They caught Miles Kerr at a warehouse near the docks while he was collecting money from a middleman. News spread quickly. The newspapers stopped covering the lawsuit and shifted their focus to the unfolding criminal case involving forgery and blackmail. 2 days later, Harold called with an update. Elaine won't be charged if she cooperates as a witness. She's already signed the agreement. Margaret said nothing, only feeling a strange emptiness where anger used to be. That afternoon, she visited Elaine's apartment. It was small, its window overlooking the sea. Elaine was folding Lily's clothes. The little girl ran around, laughing, her bright giggles filling the room. When Margaret entered, Elaine looked up hesitant. "I don't know what else to say, but I'm sorry. You can hate me forever, but please believe me, I truly regret everything." Margaret walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I don't hate you, Elaine. I'm just sad that we let the distance grow so wide between us and neither of us took a step back." Elaine threw her arms around her sister, sobbing. "I want to change Meg. I want Lily to grow up without shame for her mother." Margaret embraced her tears falling onto her shoulder. "Then start today. Don't talk, prove it." They sat together for a long time, listening to the sound of waves through the window. For the first time in months, Margaret felt her heart grow light. Somewhere she imagined Peter smiling because the two sisters had finally found their way back to each other, not through lies, but through truth. That night, Margaret returned home. She stood on the porch, gazing at the dark sea. A strong wind swept past, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "I kept my promise, Peter. It's over now." The waves broke softly against the rocks, as if answering her with a gentle sigh. And in that darkness, the woman smiled, the quiet, steady smile of someone who had walked through a storm and found her way back, standing firm amid the ashes of trust, rebuilt. A week had passed since Miles Kerr's arrest, and Ashton Bay felt as if it had awakened after a long storm. The newspapers covered the case, but no one mentioned Margaret or Elaine. The police confirmed the recording as the key piece of evidence, and the victims' identities were kept private to protect their lives. The small town gradually returned to normal, though inside Margaret the echoes remained. Every time she looked out at the sea, she could still hear the faint whistle of the wind, reminding her that justice was never something easily won. That morning, Harold called, his tone brighter than usual. "Good news, Margaret. Peter's estate has been fully reinstated. No more disputes. The police have confirmed the genuine will is the only valid one. Elaine has officially withdrawn her lawsuit." Margaret was quiet for a moment before saying softly, "Thank you, Harold. You helped me through the darkest time." "You helped yourself," he replied kindly. "I just did my job as a lawyer. Peter would be very proud of you." After hanging up, Margaret stepped into the garden. The lavender bushes Peter had planted were beginning to bloom. Their gentle fragrance drifted through the air, filling the yard. She sat on the stone bench and closed her eyes. For a moment, she could almost hear his footsteps approaching, steady and familiar, and feel his hand rest gently on her shoulder. His voice echoed in her memory, warm and reassuring. "I told you, Meg. I knew you could get through anything." She opened her eyes. No one was there, only a stray cat hiding under the tree, watching quietly. That afternoon, Grace stopped by, looking stronger and livelier, her short hair neat, her eyes bright. The police said Miles will serve at least 10 years, Grace said as she poured tea. He's got a long list of previous charges, and this time he won't escape. As for Elaine, she's joined a witness support program. They've assigned her a counselor. Margaret nodded. Good. I just want her to find her clarity again. You're too kind, Meg, Grace said with a faint smile. If it were me, I'd have turned my back a long time ago. Margaret gazed toward the sea, her voice calm. When I was younger, I thought strength came from knowing how to hate. But as I've grown older, I've learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the only way not to be imprisoned by the past. Grace chuckled. You're starting to sound philosophical. Peter taught me that. He used to say that people only truly live when they learn to let go. They drank their tea in silence, the distant sound of waves breaking the stillness. Late in the afternoon, Margaret received a letter from the hospital where Peter had worked. It was an invitation to the one-year memorial service his colleagues were organizing. She held the letter in her hand for a long while. She knew she had to go not to cry, but to say goodbye properly. The next day, Margaret drove to the hospital. Along the hallway wall hung photographs of doctors who had dedicated their lives to medicine. Peter's picture stood proudly among them, framed by soft light. Beneath it were the words, Dr. Peter Rowan. He healed more hearts than he ever knew. When the ceremony ended, people gathered around her sharing stories of Peter. A young doctor said he once stayed on a shift for 18 straight hours to save a boy he didn't even know. He told us that if anyone deserved to live, it was that child. Margaret listened, her throat tightening with emotion. Leaving the hospital, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she stopped at the hilltop cemetery. Peter's grave lay beside a row of pine trees. She placed a bouquet of lavender on the headstone and sat down. It's all over now, Peter, she whispered. Elaine is changing, and I've learned how to live again. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, scattering pine needles across the ground. She thought she heard his laugh, low, warm, and familiar. That evening, Margaret returned to Ashton Bay with a lighter heart. As she stepped into the house, she saw Elaine standing at the door holding Lily in her arms. She wore an old coat, her face hesitant. I didn't know if I should come, Elaine said softly. But Lily wanted to see Aunt Meg. The little girl smiled and reached out her hand, murmuring, Aunt Meg. Margaret bent down, lifted the child, and held her close. The warmth of her small body seeped into her chest. She's grown so fast, she said gently. Elaine's eyes shimmered with tears. I found a job at the little bookstore near the harbor. It doesn't pay much, but it's steady. I've also started taking evening accounting classes. I want Lily to grow up proud of her mother. Margaret nodded slowly. Peter would be happy to hear that. They fell silent for a moment. The distant sound of waves felt like a quiet blessing. Margaret opened a cabinet and took out an envelope, handing it to her sister. These are the documents for Lily's trust fund. From now on, money will be transferred each month into her account for her education and health care. No one can withdraw from it except the guardian appointed by the court. Don't worry, I didn't set it up to control you, but to keep her safe. Elaine took the envelope, tears spilling down her face. I don't know what to say except thank you. I'll live up to this chance. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Don't say it. Prove it. Life doesn't need promises, it needs action. After the two left, the house fell quiet again. Margaret sat by the window watching the lights from the bay shimmer on the water. A faint breeze carried the scent of lavender inside. For the first time, her heart felt truly at peace. That night, she opened Peter's journal and wrote, Today you'd be proud. Elaine has begun to look at herself, and I've learned not to fix the past. Perhaps forgiveness is the gentlest farewell a person can offer to a wound. Time passed quickly. A month later, Grace invited Margaret to a community gathering to launch the Peter Rowan Scholarship Fund for medical students in coastal areas. When Margaret stepped onto the small stage, the audience stood and applauded. She spoke briefly. "My husband believed that kindness has a ripple effect even long after we're gone. Today I only wish to continue that." After the ceremony, a man approached her. He looked to be in his 50s, tall and lean with a kind face. "I'm Samuel Green from the Medical Academy. I worked with Peter for years. Your speech was moving." Margaret smiled, shaking his hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Professor Green." "Please call me Sam," he said warmly. "If you don't mind, I'd like to invite you to join the Scholarship Advisory Board. Your experience and your story could inspire our students." She was slightly surprised, then nodded. "I'll think about it. Thank you." That night, as she returned home, her heart felt warm. After all the storms, life still found ways to open small, quiet doors she hadn't expected. On the table, the wedding photo of her and Peter still stood. She looked at it for a long time and smiled. "You see, Peter, everything's finally back in its place. And I, the woman who thought she'd fallen apart, have learned how to live again." The night wind carried the scent of the sea through the house, rustling the pages of old notebooks. In the pale moonlight, Peter's handwriting seemed to glow simple, strong, eternal. Margaret brushed her fingertips over the page and whispered, "I kept my promise. I'm still here, still believing, still living." Outside, the sea was calm. Only the sound of distant waves remained like the steady heartbeat of a heart no longer bleeding, but still alive, gentle, resilient, and full of new life. Summer arrived early in Ashton Bay. The days stretched long beneath a glassy sky, the sea shimmering with a clear blue light, each wave brushing gently against the sand like the soft breath of someone sleeping peacefully. Margaret had grown used to her new rhythm of life, morning walks along the bay, quiet afternoons volunteering at the town library, and evenings spent reading Peter's journals or writing her own. The house that had once felt heavy with loss was now filled with sunlight. The windows stayed open all day, letting in the scent of lavender salt and the quiet pulse of life itself. One Saturday morning, while she was arranging books in the library, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Rowan?" She turned around. Standing there was Samuel Green, the professor who had invited her to join the Scholarship Foundation. Dressed in a crisp white shirt, holding a folder under his arm, he greeted her with a kind smile. "I brought a few documents that need your signature to finalize the foundation's registration." Margaret nodded and invited him into the reading room. They sat by the window where the morning light slanted across Samuel's calm features. He spoke about the new class of medical students, young people full of hope following the same path Peter once walked. "If Peter were here, he'd be proud," Samuel said. "What you're doing isn't just honoring his memory, it's a gift to the future." Margaret's eyes softened with emotion. "I only want to finish what he couldn't. Peter always said a person isn't truly gone until no one continues their work." After that meeting, Samuel began visiting her more often. At first, they met to discuss foundation matters, but soon their meetings turned into long conversations over tea. They talked about books, about the sea, about the loneliness that comes with age, and the quiet peace of learning to accept. Samuel had lost his wife 10 years earlier and had 2 sons who lived on their own. He understood Margaret's heart, the feeling of stepping out of a life once full, only to realize you had to learn how to begin again. One evening, under a thin silver moonlight shimmering across the water, they sat together on her porch. Samuel listened to the rhythm of the waves and said softly, "You know, I used to believe people only have one great love in their lives. but I've learned that love never truly dies. It just changes form. Sometimes it comes back as faith, as gratitude, or in someone new we never expected." Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I don't think I have the courage for love anymore, Sam. I've only just relearned how to trust. Trust," he said gently, "is just another kind of love." She didn't answer, only sat quietly watching the sea. Inside her, something unfamiliar began to stir, not passion, but a quiet connection, the kind that grows between two souls who have both known loss. In the following weeks, they worked together more closely. The Peter Rowan Foundation launched its first scholarship campaign, and the town responded enthusiastically. Harold handled the legal work, Grace managed communications, and even Elaine joined in bringing Lily along to the fundraising events. She worked quietly without avoiding anyone, and sometimes Margaret caught glimpses of her smiling, genuine smiles, no longer forced. One afternoon, as they prepared for an outdoor charity event, Elaine approached her and said softly, "I still get scared whenever I think about the past. But maybe because of you, I've learned what it means to start over. Thank you, Meg." Margaret's eyes warmed. "Don't thank me. Live properly. That's the only real apology." Elaine nodded, then ran off with Lily, their laughter carried across the sea breeze. Margaret stood watching, her heart feeling strangely light. That night, the fundraising gala took place in the small square overlooking the bay. String lights hung from the trees, and the wind made the paper flags sway. Samuel took the stage first, introducing her as the woman who turned her grief into light for this community. The crowd rose to applaud, their clapping echoing like waves breaking against the shore. Margaret spoke slowly, her voice low but steady with emotion. "A year ago, I lost everything: my husband, my reputation, my faith. But in that darkness, I learned something. Light never disappears. It only waits for someone brave enough to find it again. Tonight I stand here, not just for Peter, but for everyone who has ever been broken and still chooses kindness." The square fell silent, filled only by the sound of distant waves. When she finished, Samuel stepped up beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "Peter is smiling right now." After the ceremony, they walked along the bay. The air carried the scent of the lighthouse and faint traces of music from the square. Samuel stopped looking at her for a long moment. "I know this might be too soon to say, but I want you to know I'm not here just because of the foundation. I'm here because of you." Margaret froze for a second, then smiled gently. "You're making me nervous, Sam." "You don't need to answer," he said softly. "Just know that someone is here ready to listen whenever the waves rise again." She looked out at the sea, her eyes glimmering under the moonlight. "I spent my whole life depending on a good man. When I lost him, I thought I had nothing left. But now I realize I still have myself and good people around me. That's enough." Samuel nodded, saying nothing more. They walked side by side in silence, surrounded by salt air and moonlight. That night back home, Margaret opened Peter's journal once more. On the last page, written in his familiar ink, were the words, "If one day you find someone who can make you smile after I'm gone, then smile. I won't be jealous. I'll be grateful." She traced her fingers along the line, her lips trembling. Outside, the waves whispered softly like a distant blessing. Margaret closed her eyes and let the wind move through her silver hair. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like the one left behind. She was living, moving forward, not for the past, but for the vibrant present Peter had left in her heart. That night, Ashton Bay was quiet, but in the small house by the shore, the light stayed on late. A 56-year-old woman sat by the window, smiling as she listened to the sound of the sea. It was not the smile of victory, but of understanding that happiness sometimes is simply the peace of knowing you can still feel whole, even after losing everything. On an early autumn morning, the sky over Ashton Bay was painted a pale gray, with clouds drifting so low they seemed close enough to touch. The air was cool and damp with the scent of the sea, mixed with the resin of pine trees from the hills behind the town. Margaret rose early, brewed a pot of hot coffee, and stood by the window overlooking her back garden. The lavender bushes were beginning to fade, their fragrance thinning with the season, but to her that scent would always carry Peter's presence, deep, warm, and enduring. Time had passed faster than she could believe. It had been nearly 14 months since Peter's passing, and almost a year since the family storm had settled. Margaret's life had slowly found a rhythm again, one she never thought possible. The scholarship foundation bearing Peter's name, the Peter Rowan Foundation, had officially come to life. The first award ceremony took place at the County Medical Center, where over 30 students received support. Samuel, now her closest friend, presided over the event. She remembered how his steady voice filled the room through the microphone. People often believe love only exists in one form, but in truth, it can transform in countless ways to stay with us. Today, that love continues through these students, through the faith Mrs. Rowan has placed in the generations to come. Hearing those words, Margaret bowed her head, a tear slipping down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from the quiet certainty that Peter was still there somewhere, among those hopeful young faces. That afternoon, she stopped by the small cafe near the library, the one where she and Samuel often met after work. The smell of coffee mingled with the sweetness of apple pie. Samuel sat at their usual table, reading through a stack of papers, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. She walked over and set a cup of coffee in front of him. "You're always buried in paperwork, even when you should be resting," she said with a teasing tone. Samuel looked up and smiled. "When you believe in something, work becomes part of your joy." Margaret sat down, her eyes softening. Peter used to say the exact same thing. "Maybe that's because we shared the same calling," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "But tell me, Meg, have you ever thought about leaving Ashton Bay? The world is much bigger than this." The question caught her off guard. "Leave here. I've lived in this town my whole life. Every memory I have is tied to these streets, these waves." That's exactly why Samuel replied gently. "Sometimes we need to leave so our memories can rest. Staying too long only keeps them watching us." Margaret said nothing. She knew he wasn't urging her to run away, only encouraging her to truly live, not merely exist within the frame of her past. That evening back home, she opened Peter's wardrobe. Everything was still neatly in place, his white lab coats, medical notebooks, and the old stethoscope he used to wear. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the cold leather, and smiled faintly. "You always wanted to take me traveling after you retired," she whispered. "Maybe you're trying to tell me that through Samuel." The next day, Margaret visited Elaine. Her sister's apartment looked completely different now, bright walls, children's drawings hanging everywhere. Lily could run and sing short nursery rhymes. When she saw Margaret walk in, the little girl laughed and ran to her, wrapping her tiny arms around her legs. "Aunt Meg, I made you a picture," she said, handing her a colorful drawing. It showed a small house by the sea, 2 women and a child standing in front of it, with a purple heart floating above the sky. Margaret hugged her tightly, eyes stinging. "Thank you, Lily. I'll keep it forever." Elaine came out from the kitchen, smiling shyly. She said, "Purple is your favorite color because there are so many lavender flowers at your house. She's much smarter than her mother," Margaret said, half joking, half tender. Elaine poured tea and sat down. "I'm still studying accounting. The exam is in 2 months. I never thought I could do it if it weren't for you. You're doing it because you want to, Margaret said. I only helped you find your confidence again. Elaine looked at her sister, her eyes shining. Do you really forgive me? Margaret was silent for a moment, then nodded. Forgiveness doesn't erase memories. It just stops them from hurting. I haven't forgotten, but I'm not angry anymore. That's enough. The sisters spent the afternoon together listening to Lily's laughter echo through the yard. When Margaret left, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. On her way home, she stopped by the pier. The autumn sea was calm seagulls gliding over the gray water. At the end of the dock, Samuel stood gazing out at the horizon. He turned as she approached and smiled. I knew you'd come. I'm heading to Portland tomorrow to meet a potential donor. I might be gone a few days. I hope everything goes well, she said, then paused, her voice softening. Samuel, thank you for being there for me through all of this. He shook his head, his smile gentle as the wind. I wasn't beside you, Meg. We've been walking together. Maybe Peter sent me to remind you that life can still be kind if you let it. Margaret looked down at the water where the ripples shimmered with the colors of dusk. Maybe you're right. I used to think the sea only tasted of salt, but now I realize it can be sweet when you know how to listen. Samuel nodded, his eyes warm. I hope when I return, you'll tell me about your new plans. Ashton Bay is just one chapter, Meg. Your life still has so many pages left to write. When he left, Margaret stood watching the small boat disappear into the mist. The wind from the sea brushed against her skin, carrying both chill and warmth. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of change. She knew she could face whatever came next, even with no one holding her hand. That night, Margaret sat at her desk and opened a new notebook. She began to write the first line. Today, I realize that happiness is not about holding on to what we once had, but being grateful that we had it at all. I've lived a long life beside the man I loved, and now I'm learning to love life again, not through longing, but through peace. She paused, smiling. Outside the window, the moon rose high, casting a silver path across the sea. Beneath that soft light, the 56-year-old woman understood that though Peter was gone, their love had never disappeared. It had become something gentler, a guiding light leading her through every season, every storm, every remaining day of her life, with an open heart and a smile no longer afraid of loneliness. Ashton Bay was silent that night, but in the little house by the bay, a warm light still glowed. A woman sat by the window smiling as she listened to the waves. It was not the smile of someone who had won, but of someone who had learned that happiness at its simplest is knowing you can still feel peace, even after you've lost everything. The early winter wind swept in from the sea, carrying with it the sharp, briny scent of salt. Seagulls glided low across the gray water, their cries echoing through the vast, empty air. Margaret stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, a steaming cup of ginger tea, warming her hands. Ashton Bay had entered its coldest season yet. Within her there was an unexpected calm. Since Samuel had left for his work trip, she had kept busy with the library, the scholarship foundation, and caring for little Lily on the nights when Elaine attended evening classes. The once quiet house now rang with the sounds of a child's laughter, tiny footsteps running across the wooden floors, and the sweet chaos that made the home feel alive again. In the mornings, Margaret taught Lily to draw. The little girl sat cross-legged on the floor, her small hands gripping colorful pencils as she carefully filled in the purple lavender rose she called Aunt Meg's garden. Every time the child giggled, Margaret felt as though she could hear Peter's voice somewhere nearby, deep and gentle. Sometimes when Lily was asleep, she would sit by the window, gaze out at the sea, and whisper, "You see this, Peter?" We still have a family, it just looks a little different now. One afternoon, as Margaret was preparing to close the library, she received a letter from Portland. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and familiar, from Samuel Green. She opened it and read. In the letter, he told her about his trip, about the new students who had received scholarships, and ended with a line that made her smile. When I return, I'd like to take you somewhere Peter always dreamed of going, the Cape Meridian Lighthouse. He once told me it was where he wanted to bring you after retirement. I think it's time we make that happen. Margaret read those words over and over, her heart swelling with a warmth that was part gratitude, part longing. She had never imagined someone could understand Peter's unspoken dreams so deeply. A week later, Samuel returned to Ashton Bay. He came by the house in the morning carrying a bundle of dried lavender wrapped with care. I kept this with me throughout the trip, he said, his eyes kind and tender. It reminded me of you. Margaret accepted the bouquet, inhaling the familiar scent that carried her back through the years. I don't know whether to thank you or blame you for making me feel so sentimental, she said, smiling through the emotion rising in her chest. Samuel chuckled. If you feel something, let it stay. Life doesn't need to be so rational, Meg. Sometimes we just need to allow ourselves to feel. That afternoon, they drove to Cape Meridian. The coastal road curved along the sea, bordered by pine forests and the breath of salt wind. When the white lighthouse appeared at the edge of the horizon, Margaret drew in a sharp breath. She had seen it before in Peter's old photographs, but this was the first time she was truly there. Waves crashed against the cliffs below, spraying white foam as the sunset painted the sea in shades of burning gold. Samuel helped her step out of the car, and together they stood in silence facing the ocean. Peter once told me this place made him feel small but free, Samuel said softly. Now I understand why. Margaret nodded, eyes glistening. He wanted to bring me here that summer, but work and unfinished plans kept getting in the way. I thought I'd never see this place. The wind picked up, carrying the salty air through her hair. She closed her eyes and listened to the rhythmic pounding of the waves, and for a brief moment she felt a hand rest gently on her shoulder. She smiled, not the smile of someone lost in the past, but of someone who had finally found peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel turned to her, his voice low and steady. Peter would be happy to see you here. He once said that if there was any place in the world that could hold Meg's heart, it would be the sea. Margaret looked out to where the sky melted into the water, their colors blending into a pale band of light. He was right, she whispered. The sea has kept everything, the pain, the love, and the memories. They stood quietly for a long time, listening to the wind hum across the cliffs. When they finally left the lighthouse, Margaret turned back one last time. Its golden light had just come on, glowing steadfastly in the darkening sky, eternal and unwavering, like the love she had carried all her life. On the drive home, she spoke softly, her voice barely louder than the wind. I think I'm ready for a new chapter, Sam. Not to forget, but to live. Samuel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, a gentle smile on his lips. And I'll be here whenever you need someone to walk beside you. Outside, the waves rolled endlessly toward the shore. Above them, the lighthouse shone through the night, a quiet message from the one who had gone before, reminding her that love, even when it changes form, remains whole through every season of the wind. The next morning, Ashton Bay shimmered beneath the winter sun. Pale golden light spread across the water, making the sea glisten like a vast mirror of glass. Margaret woke early, still carrying the lingering peace from the trip to Cape Meridian the day before. She brewed a pot of tea and opened the window to let the ocean breeze flow in. On the table, the bundle of dried lavender Samuel had given her still carried its gentle scent, filling the house with a quiet sweetness that mingled with memory, breathing new life into every corner. Over the past few weeks, she had received many letters from students whose lives had been changed by the Scholarship Foundation. They wrote that thanks to the Peter Rowan Foundation, they could continue studying, could hold on to their dreams of becoming doctors, serving those in need. Each letter was a small reminder that the love she and Peter once built together had not vanished. It had simply transformed into something enduring, something quietly alive. That afternoon, Margaret and Samuel took a walk along the bay. The wind was light. The waves brushed softly against their feet, and the sky stretched blue and endless above them. Samuel told her he was planning to move to Ashton Bay, permanently, accepting a part-time teaching position at the nearby medical academy. "I'm tired of all the traveling," he said, his eyes gazing toward the horizon. "I think it's time to stop somewhere, and I believe I've found that place." Margaret smiled, asking nothing more. In her heart, she already understood. They didn't need promises. Presence was enough. Two people who had once lived through loneliness now walked side by side along the shore, not clinging to the past, not fearing the future. When they returned home, Elaine and Lily were waiting at the door. The little girl ran into Margaret's arms, eager to share a new song she had learned at preschool. "Aunt Meg, can I sing for you?" Margaret laughed and lifted her up. The child's voice was off-key and broken by giggles, but it made her heart ache with joy. Elaine stood nearby, eyes full of gratitude. "If it weren't for you, I'd never have had the courage to come back to this town. Now I have a steady job at the accounting center, and Lily's healthier than ever." Margaret squeezed her sister's hand. "You've survived the storm, Elaine. Now live the rest of your life with grace." Elaine nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I promise, and thank you for never giving up on me." That evening, after everyone had gone, the house returned to its familiar stillness. Margaret lit a small candle on the table and opened Peter's journal. The last pages were nearly full, covered in her handwriting from the past year, not stories of grief, but of learning to stand up again, to forgive, to love life anew. She added a few final lines. "My dearest Peter, I have kept my promise. I have lived long enough to prove that kindness is stronger than deceit. I've learned to let go, not to forget, but to preserve you in the most beautiful memories. If you're watching, know that Ashton Bay is peaceful again, and I, your Meg, still smile every morning just as you once told me to." She set down the pen, closed the journal, and stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung full and bright, a silver mirror illuminating the bay. The waves murmured softly, and the wind whispered through the pines like a familiar voice. Samuel stood by the fence, waving. "I just wanted to be sure you received the students' letters," he said with a smile. "They want to meet you at next year's anniversary celebration." Margaret walked over, her smile warm. "I'll be there. Peter would want that too." They stood together in the moonlight, silent, watching the sea. There was no past left to escape, no pain left to hold. Only the present, filled with wind waves and two souls who had found each other again after all the loss. When Samuel left, Margaret lingered on the porch. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Peter, for teaching me that love doesn't end with death. It becomes light, guiding those who remain." The sea breeze swept through, making the lavender bouquet on the table tremble. Its fragrance drifted across the porch, soft and steady. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled. At last, after so many seasons of storms, she'd truly come home to peace, the kind of peace where love still lives, on quiet and eternal, like a lighthouse glowing over the midnight sea of Ashton Bay.